It started with a letter that felt more like a slap than a notice. The HOA accused Daniel of having too many cars parked outside his cabin-style home. The words were bold, stamped with red ink, and carried a demand for an additional monthly fee. For a man who had worked tirelessly for every single thing he owned, it wasn't just insulting. It was deeply personal. The cars weren't junk. They were pieces of his life. A vintage pickup passed down from his father, a modest SUV for daily errands, and a sleek red car he had saved years for. Daniel had lived peacefully in this neighborhood, respecting his neighbors and caring for his property. But the HOA board, led by a sharp-tongued woman named Karen, decided to make him their target. They called his cars unsightly clutter and claimed they lowered the neighborhood's image. As he read the notice again, Daniel's jaw tightened. They didn't know his story. They didn't know the sacrifices behind those cars. And most of all, they didn't know the truth about who really owned what in this neighborhood. The next HOA meeting was packed. Karen sat at the head of the table, smiling as though she had already won. "Mr. Daniel, the board has unanimously decided that you are in violation. Too many vehicles, too much clutter. It makes the community look cheap," she said with a smug tone. Murmurs rippled through the room. Daniel didn't raise his voice. Instead, he asked, "And what about freedom? What about property rights?" Karen leaned back, her arms crossed. "This is an HOA. Your rights end where our rules begin. Pay the new fees or face escalating penalties." People shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Some neighbors glanced at Daniel with sympathy, but most avoided his eyes. The power Karen held over them was suffocating. Daniel nodded slowly. He didn't argue further. Instead, he smiled, calmly, deliberately, because what no one knew, not even Karen, was that Daniel's father had left him a quiet empire. Every single house on that street, every patch of grass behind those white fences, all belonged to him, and he had been letting the HOA run on borrowed time. At home, Daniel sat at his desk, pulling out a box of deeds and legal documents. Each paper was proof of his inheritance. Properties bought decades ago by his late father, who had once built the very roads and homes of this neighborhood. Daniel had kept it quiet, letting families live peacefully without ever feeling owned. But now, with Karen pushing her weight around, the time for silence had ended. He thought of his father's words, "Son, real power doesn't shout, it waits. And when the time comes, it speaks so loudly that no one can deny it." Daniel felt the weight of those words. He wasn't angry about the fee anymore. He was determined to remind the HOA of who really controlled the block. The plan formed clearly in his mind. He would attend the next meeting, but not as the accused. This time, he would reveal himself as the landlord of every house the board members lived in. And when they realized they had fined the very man who signed their leases, their rules would crumble. The second meeting was even more crowded than the first. Karen strutted in like a queen, clutching papers filled with fines and warnings. She didn't know that her kingdom was already crumbling beneath her. "Mr. Daniel," she began, "since you've ignored our warning, your fines now total over $5,000. Refusal to comply will lead to liens against your property." Gasps filled the room. Some whispered about how quickly things were escalating. Karen smirked, enjoying the drama. Daniel stood up slowly, holding a thick envelope. "Karen, board members, neighbors, I think you've all forgotten something very important. This neighborhood exists because of my father, and what he built, he left to me." He opened the envelope and laid out copies of deeds, leases, and ownership papers on the table. Karen's smile faltered. The other board members leaned forward, eyes wide. "You fine me for cars parked on my street, outside houses that I own. You threaten me with liens on property that belongs to me. Do you understand what that means?" Daniel's voice was calm but firm. Silence swept the room. The board was in chaos. Karen's face turned pale as she scrambled through the documents. This must be a trick," she stammered. But the seals, signatures, and official stamps spoke louder than her denial. One by one, neighbors realized the truth. Their homes weren't truly theirs. They had been renting under agreements structured through Daniel's family trust. For years, Daniel had kept rents low, maintaining peace and stability. No one had complained until Karen arrived. Karen slammed her hand on the table. Even if you own the houses, you still have to follow HOA rules. Daniel met her glare with a steady calm. That's where you're wrong. Because without property owners, there is no HOA. And right now, I own every single property in this association. The murmurs grew louder. Board members whispered among themselves, panic spreading like wildfire. Without property holders, the HOA had no authority. It wasn't just about the fines anymore, it was about the survival of the HOA itself. The final vote was quick but devastating. With Daniel holding all the ownership rights, the HOA couldn't legally exist. Karen fought, shouted, and threatened lawsuits, but her voice was drowned out by the crushing reality. Her reign was over. Neighbors, once too afraid to speak, began to breathe easier. A man in the back clapped, and soon others followed. They weren't cheering Daniel's power. They were cheering their freedom from Karen's suffocating grip. Daniel stood before them, not as their landlord, but as their neighbor. I never wanted control, he said softly. I wanted peace. But when peace is threatened, sometimes you have to remind people where the real foundation lies. Karen stormed out, papers flying from her hands, her empire gone in an instant. The neighborhood was free. The weeks that followed felt lighter. Neighbors who once avoided Daniel now waved at him, grateful for what he had done. The cars sat proudly in his driveway, no longer symbols of defiance but of resilience. Daniel often thought of his father and the legacy he had left. Ownership wasn't about power, it was about responsibility. And in standing up to Karen, he had honored that responsibility fully. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the neighborhood in gold, Daniel sat on his porch, watching children play in the yards he owned but never claimed. He smiled, knowing he had done the right thing. The HOA was gone. The fear was gone. And for the first time in years, the neighborhood felt like home again. And that was the final twist in this unbelievable HOA story. If you loved the drama, don't forget to like, subscribe, and drop a comment sharing your thoughts. It really helps this channel grow.